Anchor. An anchor is the portion of fly line or your sink tip or your leader that is touching the water during your sweep and backstroke in spey casting. The anchor provides stick, which is caused by water tension so that the line doesn't jump out of the water during the D-loop. If your anchor is quote-unquote blown, then your line and fly will leave the water, causing a failed cast. The bloody L. The bloody L is actually a very common spey casting error in which the D-loop fails to align the anchor parallel to the forward cast. The name derives from the typical layout of the line in an L-shaped, capital L shape, on the water when this occurs. The result is a forward cast that lacks energy to roll over properly. This can be caused by a number of issues, but it's typically caused by setting the anchor in an improper position prior to your sweep, or an incomplete or shortened sweep which fails to carry enough energy into the D-loop. May I suggest, I've got a free Breaking Down the Spey Cast mini course on our Anchored Outdoors membership. I'll include the link here in the write-up, but there's a whole chapter that goes through this. A boot, or tomato, is a steelhead that has been in freshwater for a significant length of time and has taken on a darker rainbow trout coloration. The term is usually used in a derogatory manner, so you won't be hearing me say, "Oh, what a boot," but you will hear people say it, unfortunately. Bucket. A bucket is a particular location in which steelhead often lie. It can vary with river conditions and is usually quite specific. Oftentimes a run will have one or two buckets that consistently produce steelhead due to structure or bottom configuration. You'll also hear people call it a lie, but a bucket is really quite pronounced. A cack-handed cast is a cast where the D-loop is formed on the side opposite your primary shoulder while maintaining a hand configuration that puts your strong hand up on the grip still. For example, as a right-handed caster performing a cast where the D-loop is on my left shoulder, you'll notice that I'm still gripping the rod with my right hand above, meaning I'm casting, or you're casting, cack-handed. While it can be a great tool for beginners because it stops you from dropping your rod tip down and can maintain quite a tight stroke, there are still a lot of reasons why it is better to be able to have your left hand up or do both. Carrying a loop. This is referring to the excess length of line that is loosely held between the cork and the reel when you're swinging a fly. This length is largely a function of personal preference and varies from several inches to a foot or more. The concept is that by loosely holding the length of line, it'll be pulled taut when a steelhead takes, therefore preventing an excited angler from yanking the fly away from an interested fish when setting the hook. This is very controversial. Some people will say that it's dependent on the river. I know Amy Hazel likes to have a 2-foot loop at times, and I prefer to have 6 inches. I have found, and I'm starting to figure out, that this can largely depend on the steelhead behavior and how aggressive they are. But again, this comes down to personal preference. Clipped is a term used to indicate that the adipose fin of a fish has been removed, meaning that the fish is of hatchery origin. A chromer is a fresh steelhead that lacks the traditional rainbow trout coloration. As the steelhead spends more time in freshwater, it tends to take on a darker hue. Steelhead anglers generally prefer catching bright steelhead as they are at the peak of physical condition, having just entered freshwater from the ocean. So you may hear people say, "Oh, I hooked and lost a chromer today," or "a nice chromer," and that's what they're referring to. D-loop. The D-loop is the back cast of spey casting. It is the semicircular length of line that unfurls behind the angler prior to commencing the forward stroke. The name comes from the shape the line takes when viewed in profile. Dangle, or hang down. The dangle is when an angler allows their fly to complete its swing but leaves it to hang parallel to the shore in either the current or the slower water for a few seconds. Fish often bite flies on the dangle or follow them from the main current and then finally take the fly after the swing is complete. This is especially important when the water is murky, as it's quite common for fish to push in closer to shore to escape the heavier or sediment-carrying main flow, making the dangle even more important in this scenario. Think about how many times you've just been ready to start stripping in or recasting and a fish has taken your fly. Chances are you had your fly in the dangle. Grab or pull or pluck is one we're probably all familiar with. This is an event in which a steelhead has interrupted a swung fly but typically hasn't been hooked. The phrase "any grabs" is often used in riverside conversation in substitution of the more direct "catch anything?" Hen or buck. Hen or buck are terms used to describe the gender of a steelhead. The most common way of telling this is by looking at the head of the fish. Bucks, which are male, have got longer snouts and mandibles, whereas the hens have got shorter snouts and mandibles. In my experience, if you look at the maxillary, if it extends beyond the eye, that's typically a buck, whereas if it's in line with the eye, that's often a female or a hen. You might hear some people call them does as well. Kelt. A kelt is a steelhead that has spawned and is migrating back downstream to the ocean. Kelts are typically encountered in the late spring and early summer period. It is recommended, by myself included, that fishing for kelts is avoided. It is a common misconception that all steelhead return back to the ocean, as there's actually a large percentage of them that don't make it. So fishing to them when they're in poor condition only likens the chance that they won't make it. Low hole. It's when an angler steps into a run and begins fishing below you without permission. Since steelhead anglers typically work their way downstream, proper etiquette dictates that anglers start in above anyone already fishing a run. Low-holing is frowned upon virtually everywhere that steelhead swim. Unfortunately, there can be some confusion, especially for a lot of trout anglers, for example, who fish from the tail of a run up. So there can be some miscommunication sometimes on the river. My suggestion is simply to be kind and ask the angler if they wouldn't mind please starting above you. From there, you can gauge the situation on whether or not they meant to low-hole you. Overhang. The overhang is the length of running line that is extending out the tip of the rod while casting. This is largely a personal preference and typically varies from almost nothing to a foot or more. There are a few reasons why you might want to have overhang. For me, if I've got, say, a really short sink tip or a short leader or my shooting head is too short for my rod, I might want to have some overhang to lengthen my line to help me to be able to load my rod without popping my anchor. That's just one of a few situations, but there is a time and a place for overhang. Pocketpicked. Been there. Having your pocket picked is a scenario in which another angler hooks a steelhead in water that you have just recently fished. This is most commonly used in the context of swinging flies in a run with multiple anglers. Running line. Running line is a thinner, consistent diameter of line attached to the belly or head of a fly line, main fly line, or your shooting head. There are several types of running line available, including monofilament, braided, and plastic-coated fly line type. Scandy. Scandy is short for Scandinavian. It's a shooting head typically in the 30 to 40 foot length range with a long front taper. While not typically favored for casting large flies or sink tips, Scandy lines have gained popularity as an easy casting summer or fall steelhead spay line. It's what I typically use these days. In minor contrast to the Gadget is a short and heavy shooting head used in spay casting that is usually 20 to 30 feet long. It's developed in the Pacific Northwest for casting large, heavy steelhead flies with sink tips, often used for winter steelhead fishing. It's a really condensed, heavy grain weight line. Steelhead green. Over the years, it's been fun to watch this term kind of change. Steelhead green is a term used to describe a river with greenish watercolor that typically indicates ideal water conditions. I have since heard this turn into looks like butter, looks like money, looks like insert favorite word here. Stinger hook. A stinger hook is added to the back of a fly. It's commonly seen on streamer patterns and on modern steelhead flies. They provide several advantages over more traditional hooks, particularly on large flies. The positioning of the stinger hook at the rear of the fly typically results in an increased percentage of hookups, allows the use of smaller hooks that are less damaging to fish, provides the ability to swap hooks when one becomes dull, and lessens the leverage a fish is able to apply when sideways force is applied to the hook. Swinging. Swinging is a method of presenting a fly in which the fly is swept across the current in an arc while maintaining a taut line. This method typically has the ability to cover more water than that of a dead drifted presentation. To tail. To tail a fish is to grab a steelhead at the wrist just ahead of the tail in order to land it. Tailing a fish does not involve the use of a net. Again, this is something that I know personally I've evolved with. I now try to have a net with me, but sometimes it's just not practical, especially if you have a big walk-in trip. So there may be times when you will need to tail someone's fish for them. Tank. Almost like a bucket, it's usually a deeper, slower section of the river. It often holds fish, but is difficult to effectively present a swung fly in, especially if it's really tanky or soupy. To touch a fish means to get a grab or pull from a steelhead. It doesn't mean that you're physically touching a fish. It just means that maybe a fish touched your fly. So you might hear somebody around the campfire say, I touched one. The white mouse. The white mouse is the steady spray caused by the line being torn, I use that loosely, out of the water and swept into the D-loop in a waterborne anchor cast such as the double spay.